Some of my colleagues asked me to say a word or two. All of us have had powerful clinical experiences, I'm sure, in our family, ourselves. And they asked me if I would tell you about one experience in our family. In the 70s, I was the chair of psychiatry at Colorado, a name that you may be familiar with. Tom Starzl was working on liver transplants. And I didn't know much about it, and I didn't think it had anything to do with me. But I just respected what he was doing. About 15 years later, I have 3 sons. My middle son called me and said that over the weekend he had turned completely yellow, which long and short meant a liver disease, and it was a liver disease, sclerosing cholangitis. We arranged for him to have a liver transplant. During the time that he was having the surgery, we sat, the family, in the family waiting room like any other family for hours while they were doing it, nervous about what would happen. This was in the early days of liver transplant. And finally, a bed was wheeled out from the operating room. My son was in the bed, and he had tubes and needles sticking out from every conceivable pore in the body. And I followed them into the intensive care unit. And remember, this experience with Starzl and liver transplants, at least at that time, I thought had nothing to do with me, personally. Long and short, he went into the intensive care unit. They put him into bed, and I went close to his bed and leaned close to him. And he opened one eye and winked at me, which to me said, "We're there." 3 months later, he was parasailing in Miami. 6 years later, he had a rejection which required a second transplant. And 6 years after that, he had a second rejection, which required a third liver transplant. My son is quite a guy. I don't know where he gets his genes from, not from me. But he went through this in an amazing way. And so one day, the Association of Organ Donors was having a meeting here in Washington. And they asked me to speak. And I said, well, maybe I should bring my son with me. And they said, fine. So Lawrence, who's not a demonstrative or overly intrusive person, very kind of a little bit more shy, came up to the microphone after I spoke. And when he spoke, he said something very simple to these 1,500 or so organ donor gatherers. He said, thank you. Do you ever see 1,500 people cry at the same time? It was remarkable. My first son was older, had already had a family with 2 kids, and Lawrence, during the illness, was jealous of the fact that he didn't have any children. About 13 months after the first transplant, his wife delivered 2 girls. So we have twin granddaughters. If he walked into this room, unless he took his shirt off so you could see the surgical scars, you wouldn't know there was anything wrong with him. He has a great job, a great family, he's a great person. Now, I know that any of you could come up, given the massive clinical experience in this room, and tell a similar story. But we wanted to just illustrate by this example. and say the heart of the Clinical Research Forum is we love basic science. We want answers to cancer, and we want answers to heart disease and diabetes and the rest. But those of us who've been working on this Clinical Research Forum, Al, many others, for years, have valued what clinical researchers do. And we're not naive. We've been there battling in our own academic institutions for recognition of clinical researchers, and we know how a lot of academics think. And we're determined to change that. And we're also determined, we've done it before, to make sure NIH and any other funding agency recognizes how important the work that you guys do is.